Welcome back. We're now going to look at the history and the culture of ancient Athens, the other great polis during the classical Greek age. Athens covered around 1,000 square miles and had a population of around 400,000, second only in size of land to Sparta. These are not Dorian Greeks who had migrated into Greece during the Dark Ages. These were Ionian Greeks descended from the Mycenaeans. Unlike Sparta, Athens was located near the coast and developed a highly successful economy based on trade. So this is going to be Athens' great strength, is its wealth that's produced by trade, and its strength is going to be in its military, in its navy, rather than in its army. Athens followed what was the typical pattern among Greek polises or polaises, as we discussed in the last video, and they replaced the monarchy with an aristocracy. Only aristocrats who could own land could participate in the government. The merchant class, however, began to rise in influence around 700. Again, this is a very typical archaic age pattern, as we discussed last time. Merchants increase the wealth of a polis. They fight in its newer, larger armies. On the strength of this, they demand at least some of the rights of citizenship. And so we start to see tension between the aristocrats, between the wealthy traders, and between the peasant farmers. In 621, the archons, and this was the representative body that was elected from the aristocrats, they attempted to put an end to these tensions, or at least lessen them, by appointing a lawgiver named Draco to write down the laws. So this is part of the process, or part of the pattern that we examined last week as well. The aristocrats, trying to appease the merchants and the peasant farmers, they start to establish written laws and written constitutions, so everyone knows what the laws are and they know that they're being applied evenly. In general, however, Draco's law code was considered extremely harsh. Many crimes were punishable by death, and so the unrest continued. 30 years later, in 594, the aristocrats tried another set of reforms. This time, they asked an archon named Solon to write down the laws, and they gave him full authority to resolve the social and economic challenges that Athens was encountering. Solon abolished all of Draco's laws and made the penalties less severe. For example, if someone committed an act of theft, they would have to pay back 10 times the amount rather than facing death by execution. And so this shows that this society is becoming a little more stable. People are more confident that someone could raise this kind of money. They're more confident that justice could be carried out, rather than sort of more like the approach to the law code of Hammurabi we discussed a couple of weeks back. There's no real system of justice. Any kind of discipline has to be meted out on the spot. That means it's much likely to be harsher. It's much more likely to be capital punishment. Solon also outlawed debt slavery. This had become a really critical issue in Athenian society, a really critical source of inequity. Many of the peasant farmers had to rent their land from the aristocrats, and the aristocrats charged higher and higher rates. But if you're a farmer, you're going to need land. And they could charge rates of a type that meant that if the peasant farmer had one bad harvest, there's no way that they could repay back the rent they were supposed to pay on the land. So the idea is you're saying, I'm renting this land. The aristocrat's saying, here's the land, go farm it. Here's what you have to pay at the end. And the price of the rent was so high that the peasants were relying on a great harvest every year to be able to pay the rent. And if they have one bad year, two mediocre years, there's no way they're going to be able to pay their rent. They fall into debt, and then they can be enslaved to the aristocrat. And so Solon put an end to this. He also established standardized weights and measures to encourage the trade and standardize the trade that had made Athens wealthy. And so Solon converted Athens from an aristocracy into an oligarchy. The city was divided into 4 classes based on wealth and contributions to the city through taxes, rather than simply through the fact that your parents were aristocrats. Only the top 3 classes were taxed, so you've got kind of a class in society that doesn't get taxed at all. And then Solon left the city to avoid exercising undue influence. And so this is seen as part of the self-sacrifice of the lawgivers. It's part of the legend that's associated with Lycurgus as well. You create the law, and then you leave the city in order to allow the law to work. And the idea is that you don't have someone who's governing just through force of personality because they're popular. If the laws are going to work, they're going to work because they're good laws, not because the lawgiver who constructed them is popular. Nevertheless, they continued, and Solon's laws were certainly an improvement, but there also continued to be tensions within Athens. And in the year 561, so just 30 years later, a military hero named Pisistratus seized power as a tyrant, and his tyranny was pretty popular. He appointed the archons, so you still have this old school aristocratic governing body, but instead of them electing themselves, you have this tyrant who's a popular hero who is electing them, and he provided generous loans to the merchants and the farmers through the silver mines of the city. So government's providing aid to these important classes of society, while at the same time is supporting the ongoing autonomy of the archons. After Pisistratus' death, he was succeeded by his sons. His sons lacked his good governing judgment. Tyrannies, as I explained last week, are always unstable, and so both of them end up being overthrown. In the end, the final figure in the formation of the Athenian state is going to be the figure of Cleisthenes. And Cleisthenes is going to develop the system of democracy that Athens is going to make famous. And so he divided up the people by the region they were from in the city, not just from the class they were from, but also from the region they were from. And he established a council of 500 that any of the male citizens in the city could vote for. Now, I say that there are only male citizens. So this isn't a pure democracy or a democracy like we might talk about today, where every adult has a vote. This just means that male citizens have a vote. The archons, instead of being chosen by the aristocracy, were chosen by lot, and the assembly would meet 4 times a year. And at those 4 times, they would vote on the proposals made by the council. So you have a council of 500 that's elected through this democracy. They construct the laws and propose the laws to the assembly, which is made up of all the male citizens, about 40,000 or 10% of the population. And then the citizens would vote on the laws. So this is a way in which this democracy is actually purer democracy than the sort of democracy we have in the United States. In the United States, today we have a representative democracy where representatives are elected and they vote on the laws. This is what's called in Athens here, we have what's called direct democracy, which means that the citizens are voting directly on the laws. So the advantage of this is that people vote directly on their own laws. That seems to be a good idea. Disadvantages are that this is a very cumbersome and chaotic system. So you've got up to 40,000 people can vote on a single law. Normally, it's more like 6,000. Organizing a vote of 6,000 people is not easy. Also, it potentially means not everyone is represented at these votes. So you could hold them at a time that would be more advantageous to your side. Sometimes people held them in the dark. That enabled them to fudge the vote count. Most Athenians didn't have time to participate in these votes. And so you have the strength in Athens of its navy, of its wealth created through trade, of its democracy in order to provide more political access and influence to classes of society other than the aristocracy. But you also have some significant weaknesses. And that's the chaos and instability associated with the great wealth that's in the city. Wealth is always a corrupting influence in government. And also, it's the chaos associated with this primitive form of democracy that's still not very organized. Okay, so that's Athens. We're going to talk about Greece and Persia in the next video.